Breaking news today. The House has approved a bill to provide aid to Israel, but not Ukraine. The House, under Republican control, approved $14.3 billion to help Israel fight Hamas, contingent on budget cuts. The Senate plans to craft its own bill that will include aid for Ukraine and Gaza. On Thursday, despite opposition from President Biden and a divided House, a bill written by Republicans was passed that would condition $14.3 billion in military aid for Israel on domestic spending cuts and provide no money for Ukraine. The measure was passed by Republicans with a 226 to 196 vote along party lines. That's unusual for an aid package to Israel, which typically has widespread support from both parties. All but a dozen Democrats opposed the legislation, put forward by the newly elected Republican Speaker, Mike Johnson, because it would slash President Biden's plan to bolster the Internal Revenue Service's tax collection efforts. Senate members from both parties support a bill that would include aid to Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan without the IRS cuts, setting up a showdown. White House officials said on Tuesday that Mr. Biden would veto the House bill because it was limited to Israel and contained partisan poison pill offsets. The requested $105 billion package was requested by Mr. Biden. New York Democrat and Majority Leader Chuck Schumer announced in a speech before Thursday's House vote that the Senate would not be taking up the proposal as passed by the House and would instead work on its own bipartisan bill containing aid for Israel and Ukraine and humanitarian aid to Gaza. This would allow the Senate to try to impose its version of the bill on the House and see which chamber would cave in first. The ensuing disagreement may drag on for weeks, delaying the assistance. Mr. Schumer has expressed his confusion over the GOP's decision to link Israel aid to a hard-right proposal that increases the deficit and is completely partisan at a time of global crisis and an urgent need to assist Israel in responding to Hamas. But Republicans kept pushing, saying the House needs to pass Israel aid quickly and in a fiscally responsible way. At a press conference, Mr. Johnson said, "It gives Israel the tools it needs to defend itself, free its hostages, and eradicate Hamas. In order to afford this commitment to our friend and ally, we are also working to ensure responsible spending and shrink the size of the federal government." Many pro-Israel Democrats were torn by his bill because they wanted to back the Jewish state in its time of need but were wary of endorsing something that left out aid for Ukraine and humanitarian aid and took aim at their domestic policy priorities. Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries of New York and other prominent Democrats privately argued against the bill on Thursday. They were joined by several administration officials. After the vote, Florida Democrat Representative Lois Frankel said she wanted to send an unequivocal message to the world that we stand with Israel. Frankel was one of 12 Democrats to vote in favor of the bill. Ms. Frankel argued that, assisting Israel in her defense, was both a moral obligation and a matter of national security urgency. Make no mistake, Hamas terrorists and others in the region are out to destroy Israel and kill all Jews. Many pro-Israel Democrats ultimately voted against the bill because they felt it was inappropriate for Congress to impose conditions on emergency aid for a dear friend and ally. Representative Brad Schneider of Illinois said, "In my worst nightmares, I never thought I would be asked to vote for a bill cynically conditioning aid to Israel on ceding to the partisan demands of one party. As an additional aside, I also never thought that day would come that I would be asked to consider voting against an aid package for Israel, our most important ally in the Middle East, and maybe the world." But he said he could not support the bill because it was written by Republicans and was terribly flawed, weak, and dangerous. The bulk of the money in the GOP measure would go toward helping Israel replenish and bulk up its weapons systems, including $4 billion for the Iron Dome and David's Sling missile defense systems. U.S. personnel security and citizen evacuation costs total $200 million. Mr. Biden has asked for and many Democrats see as essential humanitarian aid for Gaza, but this bill does not provide it. Rather than attaching the spending cuts for political purposes, Mr. Johnson explained that he did so because House Republicans were trying to get back to the principle of fiscal responsibility. While the bill claims to reduce spending by cutting back on IRS enforcement, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office reported on Wednesday that this would actually increase the deficit by $12.5 billion over the next decade. The bill's combined spending and savings would increase the deficit by $26.8 billion. In his first days as Speaker, Mr. Johnson appeared to have manipulated the Israel legislation in order to maintain unity within his conference, which is deeply divided over funding foreign wars. His predecessor, Kevin McCarthy, was removed from his position as Speaker of the House after he pushed through legislation without the support of a majority of Republicans. These bills would have prevented the first default on the United States debt and a government shutdown. Representatives Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia and Thomas Massie of Kentucky, both Republicans, voted against the bill because they felt that taxpayer dollars should be spent on citizens of the United States. Mr. Massie blamed soaring inflation and high interest rates on excessive spending. Extra foreign aid is not within our budget. It's not just that I opposed giving billions to Ukraine. I'm also opposed to giving Israel over $14 billion in foreign aid tonight. Without the need to reduce other programs, a bill to send aid to Israel on its own would have received overwhelming support. However, many Democrats were outraged by the addition of the provision. Connecticut Democrat and Appropriations Committee ranking member Rosa DeLauro said the bill failed Israel. What the Republicans in the House have done is unprecedented, and it will cause a delay in aid to Israel, as Ms. DeLauro has pointed out. The senator continued, "This bill tells our allies that should they find themselves in an existential war for their democracy and freedom, we will not put aside our partisan wars." Mr. Johnson is now at odds with the other three congressional leaders over this legislation. On Tuesday, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky said that he and Senator Chuck Schumer were conceptually on the same page regarding the linking of aid for Ukraine, Israel, the southern border, and Taiwan. Mr. McConnell, a major advocate in Congress for sending aid to Ukraine, has stated, "We view all of these problems as connected." Mr. Johnson announced on Thursday that he plans to pair funding for Ukraine with legislation to address immigration at the southern border, recognizing how unpopular Kyiv funding on its own has become among Republicans. He argued that it was a matter of principle, that protecting Ukraine's border also meant protecting America's.